why don't you introduce this for us?
Well, of course, Henry Kissinger served as the Chief of National Security for Richard Nixon, and then as his Secretary of State. He was with them throughout Watergate and into Gerald Ford's presidency, and the two men together formulated the foreign policy, and they were an odd relationship as two men, and Henry Kissinger remembers those times. Dr. Kissinger, what do you consider Richard Nixon's greatest foreign policy achievement?
I think his most significant achievement was conceptual, that he tried to take the various elements of American foreign policy and relate them to a central theme and make them operate so that they were mutually supporting each other. Out of this then grew the opening to China, the Middle East peace process, the relaxation of tensions with the Soviet Union, the end of the war in Vietnam, and what he used to call a structure of peace, which now people would call a New World Order, that he wanted to build in his second term.
What do you think was his greatest disappointment or failure in foreign policy?
Well, his greatest disappointment was, obviously, that what had been so carefully set up in the first term could not be brought to fruition in the second term. Maybe, I don't really think there was a failure, anything you could describe as a failure in his foreign policy. Perhaps he was a little too intellectual in his approach. Perhaps he thought, he did not understand, as for example Ronald Reagan did, that you have to appeal to the emotions of the American people and not only to the intellect.
You knew Richard Nixon very well and worked with him very closely. He was such a contradictory man. Describe him for us as best you can in personal terms. How did you feel about him?
We were a strange combination because he recruited me from the staff of his major opponent in the Republican Party, Nelson Rockefeller. Our backgrounds could not have been more different. He from California, I a refugee from Europe. We had very little social contact, but that didn't mean very much because Nixon didn't have much social contact with anybody except one or two personal friends. He fulfilled himself mostly in working. Strangely enough for a politician, he was extremely shy. He hated to meet, at least until later in life, new people outside of a work context.
Part of Barbara Walters' interview with Henry Kissinger, who said they had a strange relationship. Indeed, they did. In both Kissinger's memoirs and President Nixon's memoirs, they are both flattering and critical of each other. But we've interrupted because President Clinton has now showed up at the White House and clearly wants to talk to the nation on this occasion. He's going to do so in the Rose Garden, which of course reminds us that Tricia, President Nixon's daughter, who's now 48 years old and married to Edward Cox, was married in the Rose Garden. And the fact that Tricia is now 48 and her sister Julie is 45 will remind many in our audience of the passage of time. But President Clinton wishes to speak to the nation.
It is my sad duty to report to the people of the United States that Richard M. Nixon, who served as our 37th president, died this evening in New York City at 9:08 p.m. with his family at his side. Hillary and I send our deepest condolences to the entire Nixon family. We hope that Tricia and Edward Cox and their son Christopher, and Julie and David Eisenhower, and their children, Jenny, Alex, and Melanie, know that the best wishes of all their fellow Americans are with them during their moment of sorrow. It's impossible to be in this job without feeling a special bond with the people who have gone before. And I was deeply grateful to President Nixon for his wise counsel on so many occasions, on many issues over the last year. His service to me and to our country during this period was like the rest of his service to the nation for nearly half-century. He gave of himself with intelligence and devotion to duty, and his country owes him a debt of gratitude for that service. We face today a world of increasing uncertainty and difficult challenges, but it is a world of great opportunity, in no small part because of the vision of Richard Nixon during a particularly difficult period of the Cold War. He understood the threat of communism, but he also had the wisdom to know when it was time to reach out to the Soviet Union and to China. All Americans, indeed all people throughout the world, owe him what he regarded as the ultimate compliment. He was a statesman who sought to build a lasting structure of peace. To be sure, he experienced his fair share of adversity and controversy, but his resilience and his diligent desire to give something back to this country and to the world provide a lesson for all of us about maintaining our faith in the future. In spite of everything, that faith led President Nixon to leave his mark on his times as few national figures have done in our history, and led him to continue to serve right up to the end of his life. Indeed, no less than a month before his passing, he was still in touch with me about the great issues of this day. Again, I say the sorrow and the best wishes of the American people are with President Nixon's family. We thank them, and our prayers are with them. Thank you.
Have you spoken to the family, Mr. President?
I have. I spoke with both Tricia Cox and Julie Eisenhower this evening, and we had a very good visit.
Well, are you going to the funeral?
Excuse me?
Are you going to go to the funeral?
I intend to go, yes.
Who will be, do you know?
The family has not made announcements, and I'm not sure they made final decisions. It's my understanding that the funeral will be in California, and they'll announce something about it probably tomorrow.
Will all the presidents be going, former presidents? and
I can't
family?
say that.
Can you tell us something about your relationship with Mr. Nixon?
Yes, well, we made contact with each other shortly after, I think shortly after the election, either that or shortly after I came in here. And then, as you will remember, I had him up to the White House for a visit. We talked frequently on the phone. I sought his advice about a number of issues in foreign policy, and we talked quite a lot about Russia. We had a good long visit right before he went to Russia, and as I said, just a month ago, today I think, he penned his last letter to me of his thoughts on that trip and his advice. And so our relationship continued to be warm and constructive throughout the period of my presidency, and he went out of his way to give me his best advice. And I was incredibly impressed with the energy and the vigor and, frankly, the rigor that he brought to analyzing this issue. And thank you very much.
President Clinton commenting really on three aspects of the Nixon presidency there. One, clearly the rehabilitation of the former president when Mr. Nixon says he provided wise counsel to me. The first person to invite President Nixon back to the White House was President Reagan, when he invited him back at the time of the Sadat assassination, and he then sent President Carter and President Nixon together to Anwar Sadat's funeral in Egypt. And then there is President Clinton talking about the special bond that any president feels with those who have gone before. It's a reminder that the last time a former president died was in 1973, and that was Lyndon Johnson, and of course Richard Nixon was president at the time. And of course he speaks about his resilience, and virtually everybody who has talked about Richard Nixon, both the upside and the downside, the bright side and the dark side, the controversial side, the political side of this former president who has been such a dominant figure in American politics for so long, always speaks of his resilience. There is a famous quote from Richard Nixon who says, "I've never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed as opposed to every bone or instinct in my body." This, as you can imagine, is at the time of Watergate. "But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow, August the 8th, 1974, one day before he left the White House and went into exile, which was not by any means to be permanent." 37th President of the United States dying in New York at 81. We're going to leave now so you can join your local news and other programming around the country. Not long from now, there will be a special edition of Nightline. Hope you'll join ABC News then. I'm Peter Jennings in New York.